Hello, dear friends, and today we are pleased to launch our first podcast for the first podcast of International Legal Scholars. I invite as a guest my esteemed teacher, Dr. Nasiruddeen Muhammad from University of Dubai, United Arab Emirates. And I remember Dr. Nasiruddin when I was studying at the University of Dubai. He taught me the models of ADR, international commercial arbitration, international negotiations, and economic procedural law for UAE, linking them to international practice. Even then, I liked the breadth of my teacher's horizon, deep knowledge of the legal field, and attentiveness and kindness. After I returned to Uzbekistan and we maintained the mentor-student relationship with Dr. Nasiruddin, and he recently came to Tashkent for Uzbek Arbitration Week as a participant, which was held at Tashkent State University of Law, and spent several days as a guest in our country. Assalamu alaikum, dear Dr. Nasiruddin. Welcome. Nice to see you here today, and thank you so much for taking time on our podcast.
Good. So thank you very much. As I started by saying, I thank you most sincerely for this, for organizing this. I know Dr. Mokhinur for quite a long time now. I know her as a student, as she mentioned, now as a friend and a colleague, co-author, and a co-scholar. I've been to Tashkent, as you rightly mentioned, and I have seen what Dr. Mokhinur is doing. This is really good, and I'm quite happy to be part of this podcast. Thank you very much.
Again, and after all, we know that today business relations are developing and they're even moving into the interstate economical commercial relations. And it's normal that conflicts naturally arise between business partners. And given that you are an expert in this field, and I have few questions today for you. With your permission, allow me to get your answers to them. I think it will be very interesting for our viewers. And my first question will be about the international commercial relations and why today participants of international commercial relations must resolve a dispute in ADR, and what are the advantages of referring disputes to arbitration for modern business entities, and why do you think international arbitration institutes should be used for?
Thank you very much for this interesting question. I mean, generally, when we talk about businesses, we know that there are various reasons why businesses would want to resolve their disputes through arbitration. But at the heart of it, we probably need to look at the what are the aspirations of businesses as a whole. For instance, businesses would want to know which law should govern their dispute. And that's the whole essence of reducing agreements into writing, because parties need to know in advance what are their rights and duties, including the law that would govern the contract. So in the event of dispute, businesses would also want to know which law should govern that particular dispute, where should they go to with a view to resolve the dispute, and if possible, who should preside over the resolution of the dispute. So when you put all this together, you can clearly see that only arbitration can provide this. As I mentioned, there are many compelling reasons. Number one is predictability, because businesses would want to know things in advance. For instance, who should preside over the case, which law should govern the dispute, including the jurisdiction where they want to go to. For instance, should they resolve the dispute in Tashkent? Should they go to Dubai? Should they come to? So all these are very important to businesses. Hence, the reason why businesses at times make these choices in order to have this certainty. And for long, you may recall the famous English practitioner, F.A. Mann, had wrote extensively about this in terms of the importance of legal certainty and the importance of predictability in commercial relationships. And that is actually number one, and which I believe is still the most important. But of course, apart from that, there are other reasons. I mean, one of the advantages, as we know, is flexibility. Arbitration can be quite flexible compared to litigation in many dimensions. Right from the, at times, non-application of traditional evidentiary rules to the ability of the system to insulate the process or the proceedings from the application of domestic procedural laws at times, which could actually delay the process of arbitration. So in terms of flexibility, parties can structure their arbitration in such a way that they can finish everything either in a day or in 2 days, or in essence, we can say in a matter of days, not months or not years. And this is something which litigation actually generally does not offer. There are other reasons associated with cost, but we know this reason is quite relative, because the argument that arbitration is not costly is quite questionable. But to a certain degree, it can also be advanced. When you have a very small claims, a very small dispute, it really makes a lot of sense to have an arbitration, which would obviously turn out to be cheaper to the parties. But when you have a very complex dispute, you will all agree with me that here the argument can be quite relative, because it would require hiring lawyers, payment for arbitrators, payment for facilities, which would, in a way, make arbitration a little more expensive. But still, in terms of the result, businesses are more willing to pay in order to get the desired result than to engage in a process where they cannot really predict. So this is very important in terms of why businesses actually do make this kind of choice. I have to also mention that apart from arbitration, there are other means of resolving dispute. But the nature of the dispute is actually what determines why businesses are opting for arbitration. Usually, disputes that normally go to arbitration are disputes which businesses may not want to resolve it simply through negotiation. This is not to say that negotiation is not good. We know negotiation is excellent. But at times, businesses would want to have that decisive determination, and they would want an ability to enforce it in the same way they can enforce a valid judgment of a competent court. So it is actually for that reason, either in-house counsel or businesses would make a rational decision to resolve the dispute through arbitration, not through mediation, not through negotiation, and not through litigation. And I hope that actually respond to the question. On to Dr. Mokhinur.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so since free trial settlement is convenient for international commercial relations, the practice is simpler, but how to solve the issue of judgment enforcement? And are there any problems in practice regarding the execution of international arbitration awards? And do all countries implicitly recognize and enforce international arbitration decisions?
Thank you very much for this question. And this is very important in terms of understanding what arbitration is. And maybe we can take a step backward just to look at how do we enforce judgment? Do we have problems when it comes to enforcing foreign judgments? We know that in the context of litigation, parties do end up with a judgment which can be easily enforced. So a domestic judgment can be easily enforced domestically without any hiccup. It can be problematic when it is an international enforcement or international execution, where you need to think of whether there is a particular agreement between the countries, or they are parties to a treaty and what have you. Now, when it comes to arbitration, it's almost the same. The only nuance here is to say, okay, we probably need to look at the theory before we look at the practicalities. We know it has been, I would say, not even an academic question, a theoretical question with practical implication for long, as to whether arbitration is anchored in any legal system, be it domestic or international. And the whole essence of this question is because of the ramifications associated with enforcement of the outcome. Because if we have an arbitration, for instance, in Tashkent, and we want to enforce the judgment, there is this argument or this feeling that maybe the courts in Uzbekistan may feel that they own this award because they have some sort of supervisory role over the award. And therefore, they're in control of the fate of that particular award. Now, if you have an international arbitration, you would also struggle with the same question. And the whole problem associated with this type of question is because we are concerned about the enforcement of that particular award. Should national courts be the determinant of its enforcement, or arbitration should have a self-automated system whereby awards can enforce themselves in a way, but through the mechanism of domestic courts? So back to the question, do we have a problem? Yes, we do. But we know that if we look at the New York Convention, the whole essence of that convention, which was established 8 years ago, we look at the whole essence of New York Convention is to ensure that arbitral awards can be enforced globally. And if we look at the way it is structured, that all parties to the New York Convention have agreed that they will enforce arbitral awards from wherever that award is coming from, in as much as it's coming from the parties to the convention. So to answer to that question, we'll say that New York Convention had done an excellent job in terms of ensuring that parties should not encounter problem theoretically when it comes to execution of international arbitral awards. And if we look at the membership of countries at the New York Convention, we'll see that it has virtually covered more than, obviously, 2/3 of members of the United Nations. So in general, one can simply say that there is really no problem associated with the enforcement of arbitral award on the face of it. Now, another important instrument regarding enforcement of arbitral awards is also ICSID convention. Now, we know under the auspices of World Bank, there is a Center for Settlement of International Investment Disputes, which is called ICSID. Now, ICSID is a product of a convention called Convention for Settlement of Investment Disputes as well, which is also ICSID convention, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the good thing about ICSID actually went even a step further beyond New York Convention to say that all members of ICSID will recognize arbitral awards in the same way they will recognize judgments of their domestic courts. So meaning that there is self-automated system through ICSID whereby arbitral awards should be enforced. Now, this is a little, I would say, slightly different from the method adopted by the New York Convention, because in the New York Convention, the states still have a role in terms of how you take the award from one country, you submit it to the jurisdiction of another country, and for the court of the enforcement country to recognize and enforce it. But under the ICSID, no, is automated enforcement, automated execution, because the language of ICSID says that awards pursuant to the convention should be enforced by all member states as if the award is actually the judgment of their respective domestic courts. Now, so theoretically, these two international conventions have actually helped a lot in terms of streamlining enforcement of arbitral awards and also reducing any problem that could be probably associated with enforcement. Now, what about in practice? No matter how beautiful the language of these conventions are, we know that in practice we do encounter problems. To the extent that within the international arbitration community, we can classify legal systems and we can classify countries. We can say this country is friendly to enforcement of an arbitral award, and this country is not friendly. So now this is where the practice is actually probably contradicting the theory. And this is something which is also inevitable because we know how law works. There are lots of rooms for interpretation when it comes to certain things. Now, if we look at the language of the New York Convention, which says that all member states must enforce arbitral awards by saying, yes, we have a very beautiful language in the law, both under the New York Convention and the ICSID Convention, that actually provide for smooth enforcement. But in practice, parties who want to resist enforcement, we have seen quite often they do rely on the exceptional grounds under the conventions in order to challenge enforcement of the awards. So the way to reconcile between the theory and practice is always to ensure that there is a judicial system that is friendly to arbitration and that is willing to adopt pro-enforcement interpretation when it comes to dealing with applications for enforcement or applications for challenging or resisting enforcement of an arbitral award. Thank you.
Okay, so the enforcement is governed by an international instrument. And then when the international commercial relations arise, it's very important to determine authority. And the next issue is the need to determine jurisdiction, as I mentioned before. And what can be included in the jurisdiction of international commercial arbitration, and how important is the clear borders of jurisdiction when handling disputes?
Okay, thank you very much for this question. When it comes to the jurisdiction of the arbitral tribunals, we know that the jurisdiction is by consent of the parties. So consent is at the heart of the jurisdiction. Unlike courts, whereby parties submit to the jurisdiction of the courts because the courts have inherent jurisdiction, either as stipulated in the procedural laws and what have you. In the case of commercial arbitration, the tribunals do not have any jurisdiction except the one conferred upon them by the parties, right? So consent is very important. Now, the second thing is, how far can we go in conferring the jurisdiction? So it is very important parties to design or to ensure that their submission to the jurisdiction of commercial arbitral tribunal is broad enough to cover all the issues associated with the dispute. That arbitral tribunals, because they are not like courts, do not have inherent jurisdiction. On the contrary, no, we know they do, more particularly when it comes to institutional arbitration. Of course, this would not extend to substantive issues, but procedural aspects, all that the tribunal would want in order to administer the administration would naturally fall under the inherent powers of the tribunals. So to sum up my response regarding this is to say that it is always important when it comes to conferring jurisdiction on tribunals to ensure that, first of all, the dispute is captured. So meaning that we should make it an all-encompassing dispute. The second is we should also look at the constitution of the tribunal. Do we want to have one-man arbitrator or one-person arbitrator, sorry, or we want to have three-panel arbitrator? Now, this is important. Parties need to think about the law, which law should govern, because this also goes to the jurisdiction, right? So parties need to include that the tribunal should resolve the dispute in accordance with Uzbek law or in accordance with UAE law or Nigerian law, depending on what the parties would want. Number four, parties should also, as much as possible, and this is very important, to designate the place where they consider to be the seat of the arbitration. Now, this is very important because the nation of the seat would determine which court will have jurisdiction when it comes to at times. Here, we're not looking at where, for instance, the assets are located. We're looking at the nationality of the award itself. Where is the award issued? So this is very important. And parties would also need to include, obviously, language is very important as well, because we know in international arbitration, parties are coming from different orientation or different countries, speaking different languages. The lawyers are coming from different parts of the world, the arbitrators the same. So it's very important to agree on the language so that it will go into the jurisdiction of the tribunal. And of course, I have seen of recent some quite peculiar submission agreements whereby parties can go into details even beyond the traditional typical choices. And this is naturally where parties do know precisely the kind of dispute they want to submit and the one they do not want to submit to arbitration. So for instance, if you have a very complex transaction, parties may feel maybe dispute regarding IP ownership, we can resolve it through negotiation. So parties can exclude that. So you can have a very detailed arbitration clause mentioning aspects of the disputes that parties would want to be resolved through arbitration and clearly excluding certain type of disputes because they know they have a better forum to resolve those disputes. Now, this, or the totality of this, is what would go into the jurisdiction of the tribunal. One thing is very important. The tribunals cannot manufacture jurisdiction. Now, they have to rely on what the parties confer upon them. So the more details the parties are, the better for the
for the resolution of the dispute. Now, in terms of how important, or in terms of the importance of the borders of jurisdiction when handling disputes. Now, this is also very important because, and it goes back to the issue of consent, because the tribunals cannot arbitrate over what parties have not consented to. Now, that's very important. So for that reason, it is quite important for parties to take into account what are the borders. Now, here the border, it depends, and you can clarify more here, Dr. Mokhinur. It depends on what we are looking at when it comes to the borders. There could be borders in terms of the substantive matter of dispute, so parties need to make that delineation. And there could be matters that are not even arbitrable, right? So we know in many domestic legal systems, there are provisions, or there are laws which would provide for exclusion of arbitration of certain type of disputes. Now, these are quite important. For instance, and this depends from one country to another, right? In many jurisdictions, we normally say criminal matters are not arbitrable, right? Mm-hmm. And in the case of United Arab Emirates here, for instance, disputes arising out of agency relationship, the court, the law would say, no, these are not subject matter of arbitration. So it depends from one jurisdiction to another. Thank you, Dr. Mokhinur.
Thank you very much for your answer. And okay, determining jurisdiction will certainly prevent the judgment from being reversed on appeal court. Jurisdiction is very important, as you mentioned. Yes, I totally agree with your opinion. And all we know that not everyone can work as an international arbitrator. And in my opinion, an appointment of international arbitrations to big positions, I think it's a big position to be recognized internationally as an arbitrator. And with a lot of responsibility, and requires, I think, a lot of experience from the candidate. And with this in mind, I would like to ask from you, do international arbitrators have the same arbitral immunity as national judges? And who can arbitrate in international arbitration institutions? And are there written statutory requirements for an appointment as an arbitrator?
Thank you very much, Dr. Mokhinur, for this important question. Questions regarding immunity of arbitrators is very important. But maybe to start with the second part before we come to the immunity. For instance, who can be an arbitrator, or who can arbitrate international, who can preside over international arbitrations, whether there are written statutory requirements for their appointment. Now, this is a very important question. And the starting point is to say, well, there is no statutory requirement, right? So hardly would you find this, except we know there are qualities of an arbitrator. Now, that's very important. So, but in terms of where let's say, comparing this with the national judge, where we know there are qualifications of a national judge, he should be X, Y, Z. Now, when it comes to arbitrators, we do not have that as such, unless if a particular legal system have included that in their national legal system. In some we do. Some would say an arbitrator must have the qualities of a judge. Now, if you have that, now that is really good. But in terms of saying whether there is some sort of universally accepted, and the reason is simple, because arbitration is a matter of consent. We want parties to choose who they want. Now, unlike a national judge, whereby parties do not have any right to choose, right? It's the state that appoints. In the case of arbitration, parties would want to choose who they are comfortable with. So the more we stretch on some sort of statutory requirement, the more we are taking out, or the more we'll be depriving parties of that freedom to choose. So that is one balance which needs to be drawn between the desire to uplift the standard of conducting arbitration and the ability of parties to choose who they want. That is very important. So there is no universally accepted statutory requirement as such, but we know national legal systems are free to come up with the criteria. Now, in terms of who, what is expected in terms of arbitrator is for an arbitrator not to suffer from any of the grounds that would make that arbitrator to be disqualified, right? So impartiality is at the heart of it, right? Because what we're looking at, no matter what, even though parties have freedom to choose who they want, even though the parties are the ones to choose and appoint the arbitrator, one fundamental requirement is the arbitrator must remain impartial, right? So it is not a justification that the fact that parties have appointed me, then I should be biased. So that is at the heart of the requirement. So an arbitrator must not be biased and must not be partial. This is well stated in the IBA guidelines. This is well stated in the ancestral model law, and you'll find this in all national legislations, right? Then there are desirable requirements, as we know, which is knowledge, right? Competency, qualification. Now, these are very important. And you'll discover that that's how businesses are appointing their arbitrators. Knowledge is very important. And here we can look at knowledge of arbitration and knowledge of subject matter. A knowledgeable arbitrator is likely to do the work well and to do a job well done than somebody who is simply not knowledgeable. That's the starting point. And the same thing goes with the subject matter. Imagine you have an intellectual property dispute, or you have a construction dispute, or you have energy-related dispute. Now, if you have somebody who is knowledgeable in this particular field, you're likely to have a better outcome than somebody who is not knowledgeable. And the reasons here are twofold. One reason is we're looking at the quality of the outcome. The other reason is strategic. Because if, for instance, I have no knowledge whatsoever, for instance, regarding, let's say, for instance, Islamic law, and you have a dispute maybe relating to Islamic banking or Islamic finance. As an arbitrator, it will take me some time to study this, to understand this, and this will be billed. And so at the end, it will add to the cost. Now, this is where the strategic choice will come. So if you have a dispute related to that, it would make sense to appoint somebody who is also knowledgeable in the subject matter, because chances are that arbitrator will not spend much time to understand. The same argument goes with construction disputes. If you have somebody who is knowledgeable with construction issues, he can easily understand what it means to constitute a delay, what is snagging, what are the industry requirements, without taking unnecessary time to rely on the experts to be presented. So this is also at the heart of the qualification. And of course, integrity. Integrity is also very important, because I'm looking at this because this is what will determine the immunity at the end. Integrity is very important because at the end, arbitrators are dispensing justice. And what matters when it comes to this is the integrity of the panel. An arbitrator that is known to be highly reputable, capable of being fair. And this is not to say there should be an edge over senior arbitrators over the newcomers. No, I may not have any previous record of presiding over an arbitration, but you can tell from the pedigree of my CV that I'm capable of dispensing justice. Now, these are all part of the things which parties need to take into account when it comes to appointing an arbitrator. So, in summary, we can say that responding to the second part of the question, a person who can be appointed as an arbitrator is obviously somebody who has the pedigree and the necessary requirement, even though there may not be statutory requirements, but there are best practices when it comes to this. Now, do arbitrators have immunity like national judges? Now, that's a tricky question. We know that arbitrators, they do have immunity. Now, the question is it immunity like that of national judges? Now, this was a debate sometimes here in the UAE. There was a time when there is a provision under the penal code, under the procedural law, which put together arbitrators along with experts by saying that they can be liable. So meaning that the immunity was actually taken away, but this has been amended now. So in other words, it will be quite absurd to expect arbitrators to be drafted into a litigation on the basis simply they have presided over a matter. Now that is unacceptable, and that's why arbitrators, they do have immunity from prosecution when it comes to the conduct of their work. Unless we know to every general rule there is an exception, just like national judges. And this is not to say that, to my knowledge, I have never come across any case, but it is something that can happen. If there is a case in which an arbitrator is found wanting, maybe committing a crime involving either taking a bribe, now that would obviously fall under the exceptions. And in that case, there will be no immunity. In the same way, it will apply to national judges. So arbitrators are immune from criminal prosecution regarding the conduct of their arbitration in general. The only exception is when they are engaged in a criminal activity, in which case the same would apply even to national judges. I wouldn't want to jump to say it is always like national judges, because when it comes to national judges, the immunity at times is not just statutory, it has multiple layers. So for instance, in some jurisdictions, even if you have a case against a member of a judiciary, there is a judicial council that is responsible for that. Now, in the case of arbitrators, we do not have that, right? So that's why I wouldn't jump to say it is immunity like national judges, but we know arbitrators are immune from prosecution over the conduct of the arbitration, unless if they engage in a criminal activity. But having said that, for each country, we need to look at the legal system, because not all legal systems are the same. The only thing is there are international best practices regarding this as part of the guidelines, for instance, issued by the IBA regarding the conduct of arbitrators. So if you look at that, you will see that arbitrators are supposed to have that immunity. And it is our responsibility when it comes to designing our domestic laws to ensure that arbitrators are protected. Otherwise, they will never be able to do the job. So, because there will be lots of cases, going to court over the conduct of arbitrations. Thank you, Dr. Mokhinur.
Thank you. Okay. So it can be said that an arbitrator is a non-state position.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Dr. Nasiruddeen, our conversation is becoming very interesting, and thank you for sharing your scientific and practical knowledge with us. And now, with your permission, let's talk about one of the types of ADR, which is international negotiation. And my question is, what is the commercial negotiation, and how two parties should prepare for the negotiation, and how to succeed in a negotiation while creating a good customer relationship, and what types of disputes are currently being resolved through international negotiations, and are there any advantages to negotiating disputes?
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mokhinur, for asking this question. And as you rightly pointed out, this is like a little switch from arbitration to negotiation. Now, the starting point, which I would consider to be the general question, which is, what is commercial negotiation? Now, I think we all know we negotiate every day. We negotiate at home with our siblings, with our daughters, sons, with our wives, with our husbands. It happens. It's something that it's a daily thing. So negotiation is something that we all know, that everybody does. And one can clearly say there is no exception. Everybody engages in negotiation. But I like the question which you asked, which is, what is commercial negotiation? Now, this is very important, because commercial negotiation is not the same as the type of negotiations that we generally do at home. Of course, the skills would be relevant, but the context actually differs. Some would say, for instance, negotiation is give and take. And this is one of the simplest definitions one can play with. To say it's give and take, meaning that when it comes to negotiation, you should be ready to give and you should be ready to take. The other party should also be willing to give and be willing to take. Now, what that clearly means is, in commercial negotiation, parties are coming prepared with a plan in terms of at what level are they willing to give in, and at what level are they willing to concede to a particular presentation. But there are, of course, we know certain type of negotiations that are like zero sum. So where it's all about taking, there is little giving. Now, and in commercial negotiation, it's also like that. Of course, some of us, and I myself, I belong to that school whereby I do not believe that there are negotiations that are completely zero sum. Even in the case of zero sum, there is still a room for maneuver. And if there is a room for maneuver, what that means, there could be some give and take, even though the gives may not look really actual, but they may appear to be like give. So in commercial negotiations, parties are trying to resolve their dispute, their difference, their misunderstanding without being assisted. Now that's at the heart of understanding what commercial negotiation is. In other words, they want to face each other and they want to resolve the dispute among themselves without the help of a mediator, without the assistance of arbitrator, or without intervention of court. So not all disputes would actually be a good candidate for this kind of method. There are certain disputes in which parties can still negotiate and say, oh, we believe this aspect is better, we submit this to a mediator. However, disputes regarding A, B, C, we can negotiate among ourselves, right? So when it comes to commercial negotiation, parties would always try to identify the type of commercial disputes which they can face each other, which they are willing to make certain adjustments, to make compromise in order to arrive at a viable solution that would work for both, not for one party. Now, that's one fundamental characteristic with a good negotiation, because at the end, a good negotiation has to be win-win. Both parties must be happy at the end of it. They may not necessarily get what they want, but they are supposed to achieve their objective. And these are two important things. It is one thing to get what you want, and it's another to achieve your objective. So negotiation, a successful negotiation, is about achieving the objective, not necessarily getting what you claim or claiming what you want. And that's the way to arrive at what we call win-win, whereby both parties will go happy. So that's how we can look at a commercial negotiation. Now, with this broad understanding of commercial negotiation, it would, naturally, it would mean that parties would have to prepare for this. Because if I'm talking about achieving my objective, not necessarily getting my demand, then I need to prepare for this. I need to, first of all, clarify what is my objective in the negotiation. So imagine two commercial entities negotiating a dispute over, let's say, the price of a subject matter. And the parties have been in business negotiation for the last 10 years. You may discover that one of the objectives could be the continuity of that business relationship, not necessarily winning over the price issue. And another objective could be, no, I want to end this relationship because I have a better partner. Mm-hmm. So you will discover that the dispute over price is not the main issue. The main issue is about whether the relationship should continue, whether it shouldn't. So when parties are going into this kind of disputes or this kind of negotiations, naturally they would have to prepare. It is considered one of the best practices. And there are various methods whereby parties can prepare for this kind of negotiations. First of all, parties need to have clarity in terms of the objective, which is very important. The second is parties must be willing to make adjustments when it comes to negotiation. The third is parties must identify what is their alternatives. So, and this is where the role of alternatives comes in when it comes to negotiation, because you're not going into negotiation that it has to be my position or no more discussion, because that is not a negotiation, that is something else. A good negotiation is, I have my objective, this is what I want, then I do have other options which I'm not presenting now till when the negotiation goes on. So this is what we call alternatives. And with the alternatives, we have various categorizations there. So a good negotiator should be able to know what are the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, what is the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement. And this is what we call Watna, Malatna, and what have you. These are good terminologies when it comes to negotiation. And we use a conundrum to draw this so that when you're going into negotiation table, you can identify what we call a no-go area. So at the heart of preparing for negotiation is, first of all, to even ask yourself, do I have to negotiate this? Now, this is very important because not all type of disputes are good for negotiation. Imagine if I have an upper hand and I have options. So let's say we're talking about distributorship agreement. I'm in the business of production, and I have options to have multiple agents. At times, it will be a waste of time to be negotiating with one agent, right? Because you already have options, unless if there is something specific. So we always ask ourselves, why do I have to negotiate? And the rule is always negotiate only when you have to. So you shouldn't negotiate when you don't have to negotiate. And the way to understand this is always to interrogate yourself, not by looking at what you want, but by looking at the objective behind what you want. Because at the end, a successful negotiation is the one that achieves its objective. So at times, when you can go to a negotiation, for instance, and you'll say, oh, my demand is, I need X. And the other party will say, okay, you get it. You'll discover that most of negotiators will not be happy with this outcome because that is not negotiation. It's not a negotiation, it's something else. And you'll have to ask yourself, what happened? Was the other party scared? Were they intimidated? Have they discovered an alternative? Could it be they are not revealing something to us which would later backfire, you know? So this is not negotiation. But a good negotiation is the one that, oh, I have this objective, and at the end, I have achieved my objective, not necessarily getting my demand. Another thing which is also important at the heart of preparation is to understand that in negotiation, you deal with a pie, and it's not about getting it all, right? It's about how you split it, because that's what will lead to the win-win. If I'm to take it all, that will not be win-win. The other party will not be happy. And even if I'm happy by succeeding now, the happiness may not last for a very long time. But if both parties are happy, you will have an enduring peace for a very long time because both parties are happy having achieved their objective. So these are some of the things that we always need to take into account when it comes to preparing for the negotiations, always to prepare for the alternatives, not to go with a single option to the table of take it or leave it, which at the end may end up spoiling a business relationship. The third part of the question, which is very important, regarding customer relationship. This is at the heart of all negotiations. Creating a good customer relationship is at the heart of negotiation. And in terms of how to succeed in negotiation, this is very important. And this depends, there is no hard and fast rule in terms of how to cultivate this. It depends from culture to culture, and it depends from context to context. And that's why it's always good for a negotiator to understand the negotiating environment. In some cultures, it will be considered rude to go to a negotiation table and start with the subject matter of negotiation. So if you go into that kind of negotiation and you start with just straight into the point, the others may not feel comfortable, and you may not succeed at the end because you have started with the wrong premise. So it is always good to look at that. What does it take to build a rapport before we even go into the negotiation table? And here we have two approaches. We know we have hard negotiators, and then we have good negotiators. Hard negotiators at times would think to make life difficult to the other party is part of the tactics of winning negotiation. Mm-hmm. Now, this is also wrong. It may have worked for a short term, but it may not work for a long-term business negotiation. One of the common examples we normally give is to invite somebody for negotiation, not to a negotiation table, but to somewhere where you are comfortable. So you have maybe a negotiation table with a single chair and a big table, whereby you'll be expecting the other party to either stand or to sit without a chair, trying to make life uncomfortable. Now, that is really not a good approach. But of course, we know some of those hard negotiators have also come up with many tactics, which is to put a very uncomfortable chair, for instance, for the other party. So this is also not a very good negotiation. A good negotiation is to make the other party also feel comfortable, feel at home, feel relaxed. So when that happens, that would go a long way in terms of building good relationship through the negotiation. Because at the end of negotiation, there is one thing which is very important, is trust. Parties are willing to open up in negotiation when they feel they can trust the other party. Now, and this is something that many have navigated for long, because as rational negotiators, as scientific as we want to be, we always want to kick out this aspect. We don't want to rely on trust, because trust can be quite subjective. We want to rely on something that we can see, verify, analyze. But still, when it comes to negotiation, still at the heart of it, trust is critical, because now we are dealing with human behavior, right? So it has always remained that parties in negotiation would feel more comfortable when they feel they can trust the other party. And if that is the case, then to cultivate a good relationship is the most successful tool towards a successful negotiation, right? So good customer relationship is quite critical. Otherwise, parties may simply back out from negotiation. Thank you very much, Dr. Mokhinur.
Thank you. It's so interesting. And what do you think? Is it better for economic partners to refer disputes to arbitration, or they should settle through mutual negotiations?
Oh, that's a very, very tricky question. I'll give you an example. Remember, we started by saying do not negotiate unless when you have to. So you resolve dispute through negotiation when the only way to achieve your objective is through that. And one good example, and let's look at international negotiation. So imagine we have interstate dispute, but we need to link this to a commercial activity because this is the subject matter of our discussion. So imagine you have a border between two neighboring countries, and the border or the disputed part is endowed with natural resources. So you see, at the heart of this dispute is the economic benefit that both countries would reap from this particular disputed either island, a territory, or whatever. So when you have a dispute like this, of course, one way of resolving it is for country A to send its military, take over the land, put its flag, and start exploiting the resources, right? Now, using brutal force may probably give a sense of winning, but you cannot predict for how long will this last, right? Of course, the other country may either try to strike back if they're strong, and even if they cannot, you never know how local people will behave. So in one way or the other, you have that fear of the business can be sabotaged, either by government or by people from the other side. So in this kind of case, you can clearly see this is the best way to go about this. And both are having legitimate claim over this. And it's not something that can be decisively resolved, not even through arbitration, let's say, even through litigation, because there's nothing you can do. Even if you go to litigation, it will take ages when it comes to disputed territories. So in this kind of situation, one way of fixing this is to negotiate a method of commercial utilization of this so that parties or both countries can benefit and share the profit together. So in the context of natural resources, we're talking about, let's say, utilization negotiations, where parties will negotiate in good faith, exploit the resources there, divide the proceed, and everybody is happy. And the aim is obviously to get the economic benefit, and both countries are getting it. So if you look at a context like this, I would say a dispute like this is better resolved through negotiation and not through any other means, right? But there are other type of disputes whereby the best way to resolve it is actually through arbitration. And usually these are kind of disputes which would naturally go to court for litigation. But because parties want to save time, they want to have predictability, they can opt to go through arbitration. So in most cases, these are instances where parties are not looking at maybe even continuity of that particular commercial relationship. They are willing to say bye-bye and go on with their lives. Or even if they want to continue, they want to have a clear-cut decision, which is an award, so that the parties will never go back to that issue again. So they can just be looking at the future. So when you have disputes like that, then my recommendation would be that kind of dispute is better resolved through arbitration than through negotiation. The problem with this kind of question is there is really no one cap fits all. You know, you cannot find one cap that will fit all the cases. But if you look at the current disputes that are generally resolved through negotiation, one would comfortably say that most of commercial disputes are initially being attempted to be resolved through negotiation. But when the negotiation fails, then parties would say, okay, since we cannot negotiate, the best thing is we go through arbitration. And that's what multi-tiered arbitration clause is all about, which is to say that parties can start by negotiation. If they cannot negotiate, they can go to arbitration. Thank you, Dr. Mokhinur.
Okay, do commercial negotiations around the world differ from others, or do the parties rely on any international document to settle the dispute?
Thank you very much for this question. Now here, you're kind of really hitting on a very important, or you have pointed at a very important issue when it comes to negotiation. We know, or it goes without saying, that cultural influence in negotiation is real. No matter how we try to have some sort of standardized frameworks for negotiation, and negotiators are being trained, still, when it comes to cultural nuances, we cannot escape that. And the culture here is broadly defined. We're not just looking at people, we're not looking at countries, we're not looking at geographical locations. We can even look at specializations, because the way lawyers negotiate differs from the way business experts at times negotiate. And it also differs from the way engineers probably would negotiate. Because in all these areas, there are certain traits which members of the profession have all been identified with. So really, the question is, are there differences? The answer is yes. And starting with the most obvious is to say that the way an English, let's say, negotiator would negotiate would likely differ from the way a Japanese negotiator would negotiate, or the way a Chinese negotiator would negotiate. And this goes back to maybe one good example, which we always talk about in terms of human relationship or building a rapport. It is quite common for an English negotiator, for instance, or somebody trained in that fashion, to simply come to a negotiation and go straight into the issue after greeting each other and say, okay, let's start. Now, this may not be something which a Japanese or a Chinese negotiator would start. Maybe they may want to have some sort of bonding before the discussion. It could be maybe by maybe drinking maybe a tea, could be green tea or something, maybe a little chat. And of course, during that period, the negotiator is weighing and assessing the other party in terms of how do we build a relationship to proceed. Now, these are cultural influences in negotiations, and these are real. And it is always good for a good negotiator to put yourself into the other person's position. So if you are negotiating with an English negotiator, you'll try to do that thing that would make him or her comfortable. And the same thing if you're negotiating with a Japanese or Chinese negotiator, it is your responsibility as a good negotiator to put yourself in his position in order to make him or her comfortable. So whatever you will do in order to achieve that, it is something that is considered a good negotiation practice. So here, my response is simple. Yes, the commercial negotiations around the world differ. If you go to Africa, for instance, the approach may be different compared to, let's say, the approach in the States or in Europe. In terms of whether parties do have to rely on international document to settle the dispute, I wouldn't say they have to, but if you have it, the better, right? And of course, here we need to also make a distinction between types of negotiations that we're talking about. Commercial negotiation is pretty straightforward, but we do also have international negotiations, right? And it's happening in various dimensions now. In the context of environment, we do have climate change negotiations that are taking place. In the context of artificial intelligence, we know lots of instruments are being negotiated. In the context of world trading system, lots of rounds of negotiations are taking place. So I will say we need to kind of make a distinction between those that would naturally require some sort of documents and pure commercial negotiations, which may not necessarily need that. But at the heart of it, all that matters is at the end, if a dispute is resolved, the the outcome need to be respected. And that's the most important. And the question is, how do you secure that? Now, in the context of negotiation, it is a little tricky because it is not like arbitration. We don't have a mechanism of enforcement, but we do have a settlement, right? So the best advice is always to say, when a negotiation is conducted, let it be reduced into writing, let it be signed by parties, so that that document in itself can be presented should any of the parties decided to back out from it. The document can be used and can be presented to court for the court to enforce it as a contractual obligation between the parties. Now, this will depend from one legal system to another. Under common law, we know there is no standalone principle of duty to negotiate in good faith. Mm-hmm. But under civil law, there is an obligation to negotiate in good faith. So the jurisdiction where this is to be presented also matters. And I would say enforcement of negotiation in civil jurisdiction is likely to be much easier than enforcing a negotiated settlement in the common law jurisdiction, unless and until where you have it signed. Then in that case, you'll discover that common law is also very, very, I would say, supportive to things reduced to writing, signed by parties, to the extent that common law would not allow parties to derogate from a written agreement which has been entered into between the parties. So thank you very much, Dr. Mokhinur. I hope this responds to the question.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. Dear Dr. Nasiruddeen, thank you so much for today's informative and much needed conversation. Thank you so much for agreeing to be the first contributor to the International Legal Scholars podcast, Sparing No Time. And I'm really proud to have you as my mentor. And dear viewers, and keep following us. We always invite experts in your areas of interest into International Legal Scholars podcast. See you in the next episode of our program. Goodbye and be well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mokhinur. The pleasure is mine. Take care. Thank you once again. Bye.